Hello and welcome to the second mix on biodiversity and conservation. During this mix we will be basically looking into the general idea of what biodiversity is, but before we can get into biodiversity, we got to go back and do a little bit more revision on the idea of just general ecology and ecosystems and communities inside an environment so that you better understand how we're going to measure biodiversity, which when we talk about actually quantifying biodiversity, that will come in our next mix. We'll learn about how we actually measure the number of species, and we do comparisons of the number of species between different populations. So today we're going to be focusing on really, again, going back and defining the ideas of species and ecosystems and niches, and how niches are an important part of ecosystems and communities. We'll be looking at how biodiversity is measured, or how we define it. So we'll be looking at the variation in an ecosystem or an habitat, the number of species and their relative abundance, and of course genetic variation within each species, making greater diversity between the species itself. And then last, we'll be looking at the importance of random sampling for determining biodiversity of an area, and then we will be talking more about this last part in the next PPT mix, where we will discuss how we measure biodiversity in an environment. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this and you learn your outcomes.
You have failed me for the last time.
Okay, so before we jump into, once again, the idea of how biodiversity is measured and why it's necessary, just a little bit of ecology revision. So do you remember what ecology is? Yes. So when we're talking about ecology, we're basically talking about the study of living things on Earth, but specifically how they interact with their environments. And when we talk about the environment, there is, remember on your exams, there's always two vocabulary words you need to make sure that you consider. They're the two types of factors that make up an environment. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we're talking about all the living things in that environment and these two factors, and we call these two factors, do you remember? That's right, our biotic and our abiotic factors. So we're looking at ecology, we're looking at not just living things themselves, but how do the living things interact with other living things, and how do the living things interact with non-living things. And if you remember from before, when we take ecology, we break everything down into different levels of specificity, kind of like we do with taxonomy. The most general idea is the biosphere, what we call basically Earth. And the biosphere can be broken into different areas depending on what type of environment you're dealing with. For example, we have our hydrosphere, which is basically all our aquatic environments like lakes and rivers and oceans. We have our lithosphere, which is everything that's in the ground or down in the rock structure. And we have the atmosphere. And atmosphere is, again, anything that's dealing up in the atmosphere, basically up in the air. Okay. So from there, we can break any one of these down even further using specific ecology vocabulary, which I will review on the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about ecology, there's different ways that we can define what ecology is. First off, there's basic ecology, which is just studying trends through species interactions. So basically observing nature and just understanding nature, why things do what they do, and what are the forces or what are the factors that create certain species to interact the way that they do, or species to do better than others. And then there's another branch of ecology, which is the more active branch of ecology, called applied ecology. And this is where we're basically trying to prevent or ecological damage or repair ecological damage. And this typically has to do with reversing negative effects caused by humans. If you remember, you're going to be doing some presentations on these concepts in class, looking at different ways that we try to do active ecology. But regardless of the ecology, we still break down classification into 6 different levels. First, we again have our biosphere, which is the largest and most general, which would be the entire Earth. And then from there, we have different biomes or different climate regions, for like a desert or a mountain, or a forest, or a tropical rainforest, or a field, or a lake. Those would be very specific biomes. From there, we have the ecosystem. And remember that the ecosystem, we're looking at the movement of nutrients and energy in an area, so we're looking at all of the biotic and abiotic factors inside that one specific area. When we talk about a community is just the biotic factors, so just the populations and how the populations are interacting in their environment. Then we have our population, which would be just one specific group of one species. And then inside that population, you would have an individual, which is just one member of that population. So try to remember these levels of ecological classification. It's mostly revision, but it is important that you understand these vocabulary words and then you can use these vocabulary words correctly when you're answering a question. So the level of ecology that we are interested in talking about for this unit is really looking at the ecosystems and the communities inside of those ecosystems that are interacting with each other. So mostly, how are populations interacting with each other? So a lot of the biological factors and a little bit of the abiological factors as well. So if you remember, the interactions between living things and non-living things are biotic and abiotic factors inside of a living area. This is our environment, or the ecosystem. And then when we look at the community, we're just looking at different populations of living things. So we're just looking at how the biotic factors are interacting with each other. And there's lots of different ways that interactions can occur between them. So some examples, for example, would be coevolution. And in coevolution, for example, there will be changes that are promoted by the interactions between two or more species. So for example, here we have a pretty hummingbird with a really long beak and he needs this very long nose, or beak, sorry, and a very long tongue, because he wants to get nectar that's deep inside of this plant. Now the plant wants the hummingbird to interact with it because it's going to be a pollinator for it. It's going to help spread the pollen of the plant and help the plant on its reproductive cycle. And of course the hummingbird is going to want the nectar because that's a great source of energy, because there's so much sugar in nectar, so many carbohydrates. Now, as different plants and different bird species are interacting with each other, there can be a joint evolution. There could be a positive one, for example, where the hummingbird is getting a longer and longer nose or mouth over time, as it is making it easier for the hummingbird to get the nectar out of the plant. This might encourage more of the plants that the hummingbirds are feeding from to reproduce, which might mean that there's a positive selection for deeper and deeper plants, or deeper and deeper flowers. So these start getting longer, the section that holds the nectar, and actually over a long time, that might encourage the hummingbird's nose to even get even longer. Sorry, its beak. I keep calling it a nose, but really it's its beak, it's its mouth. So we can see that there is a possible coevolution happening there, and there's positive selection both for the length of the hummingbird's mouth and the selection for the style of the flowers that we see in the ecosystem. There can also be more negative selection, where there's species are going back and forth, doing both positive and negative selection towards each other. For example, like a predator-prey scenario. If you guys remember, before we had predator and prey charts. So for example, if we had this rattlesnake and this mongoose, and the mongoose and the rattlesnake, the mongoose actually eats rattlesnakes. So it's actually it's fairly good at preying on a rattlesnake. So if the rattlesnake population goes down, showed in red, the mongoose population, which was probably pretty high, is now going to start to go down too, because it's running out of snakes. As the population for the snakes goes down, for the mongooses go down, there's less things eating snakes, so then the snake's population can start to come back up. And if the snake population starts to go back up, then it's easier for the mongooses to get food, so then their population can start to go up. And we see that this trend repeats just over and over and over again. through time. So that would be an example of a predator-prey interaction. And there can be coevolution in addition with these predator-prey interactions because it can create somewhat of an arms race. A herbivore and plant, by the way, also can go through these interactions. An arms race basically is where these two species are trying to outdo each other, where the snake may try to become immune to the poison that might be used by the mongoose. The mongoose is trying to become stronger and stronger poison to outdo the resistance of the snake. We call it an arms race, where they're basically trying to outdo each other's weapons in order to be more efficient at killing each other. Another feature of coevolution with predator and prey interactions would be certain coloration. So we have our aposematic coloration of the bright contrasting colors that warn things that they are poison. So for example, this mongoose maybe isn't going to be this brown boring color, he's going to be red stripes and maybe yellow stripes, and then maybe sections of black between him. So maybe instead of getting stronger and stronger poison, there's a coevolution that promotes the mongoose to change its or get a striping pattern that tells the snake, hey, I'm poisonous, I'm dangerous, you shouldn't try to attack me, you shouldn't try to eat me because I will be bad for you and I could possibly kill you. So this is just one example of the type of interactions that can happen between species and a community. Now, the most common the most common interaction, though, instead of something like coevolution, would be actually more likely to occur would be competition. And you guys all understand competition. You are constantly competing for seats when you go to the lunchroom. You're competing for access to food. You guys compete for wall sockets so that you can charge your iPhones and your computers. You compete for internet. People always taking away your Wi-Fi and slowing down your internet. So there's different types of competition that happens in environments. There can be interspecific competition. And interspecific means that it's competition between different species. So for example, here we have hyena and a lion. And for example, the hyena is trying to get access to the same food that the lion is eating. So the lion has killed something, maybe an antelope, and he's eating the antelope, and the hyena would like to also eat the food from the lion. So they're kind of competing against each other for access to this food. The hyena will try to sneak food away from the lion, and that's probably going to make the lion angry, so it's going to try to keep the hyenas away. It's going to compete against them. We could also have intraspecific. And intraspecific means it's competition within the same members of one species, of one population. So for example, here's intraspecific, where we have rams that are maybe fighting each other for access to a female. So they're going to smash heads together until one of them gives up, and the one that wins gets to reproduce. So they're competing for the rights to mate. You could also have interference. Interference basically is when a species directly are going to limit access to resources. So for example, maybe certain species are, lions, for example, they're also going to need water. So maybe if a group of lions are keeping other species away from a source of water because they want it to be their source of water and they don't want anybody else, any other species coming and taking the water from them, so they chase everything away that gets near that water. That would be an example of interference. Okay, or for example, lions chasing away hyenas, trying to prevent them from getting access to their food or their sources of water. We could also have exploitation competition or exploitive competition, and that's where species will actually lower the amount of resources that are available, so it actually makes it harder to find. So a good example of this would be against birds and squirrels or chipmunks in a park. So typically birds and squirrels are probably going to eat similar foods. They will eat fruits and nuts and insects. And so if a bird's using their wings and their aggressive nature and their large groups start eating all the seeds. By eating the seeds, there's less food for the squirrels to have access to, so they're not necessarily trying to keep the seeds away from the squirrels, but by eating the seeds, they're just taking away the resource away from the squirrels. So it's going to be harder for the squirrels to find food for them because the birds have eaten all of it. All of these different types of competition basically can be seen in nature to support a really key principle that we see in ecology, which is called the competitive exclusion principle. And this basically comes down to the idea that if two populations of different species, regardless of how similar they are, if they require the same limited resource and they get the same limited resource in the exact same way, one of them must destroy the other. They cannot exist at the same time. So for example here, if we were to take these two different species of paramecium, and if we grow them on separate cultures, they are perfectly fine. They both have access to nutrition. They're going to get that nutrition in the exact same way because they're not competing against each other, because they are separated from each other. Both populations will grow perfectly fine. However, if we combine them, if we put them on the same petri dish, okay, if we put them on the same petri dish like this, and they have to use the same source of food, and they're getting that food in the exact same way, one of them is going to destroy the other. One of them eventually has to lose. One of the species is just going to be better adapted or more aggressive or reproduces faster, whatever the case might be, but something will allow one of the species to do better, and the other species that does not do better will get eliminated. For example, another way you could think about this is in terms of business. Think about Starbucks and Costa Coffee. So we have Starbucks and we have Costa. Now they both serve coffee, and often you can find them inside the same malls, but they cannot serve the exact same coffee for the exact same prices and be in the exact same locations, or one of them is going to go out of business. People might choose Starbucks, and so then Costa Coffee goes out of business, or maybe people choose Costa Coffee and then Starbucks goes out of business. So they're going to have to vary themselves. So Starbucks will serve certain food that Costa Coffee doesn't serve. Costa Coffee is going to have cheaper coffee, so that maybe people with less money will go to Costa Coffee, and people that want more expensive coffee will go to Starbucks. So we see that actually this competitive exclusion principle, it doesn't just work in ecology, it actually works in business very well as well. Businesses have to be a little bit different from each other, because if they are exactly the same, eventually one that is slightly better than the other will do very well, and the ones that are not different in some way, they will just disappear. They will go out of business. So the reason why I'm bringing up all these different competitive interactions and way that species can interact with each other, and the idea of the competitive exclusion principle, is because this is the reason why niches have to exist. And if you don't really remember what a niche is, don't worry, we'll go over it again. But a niche basically is the very specific way a species interacts with its environment, interacts with the biotic and abiotic factors around it. So a niche is going to be everything about that species. The niche is going to be where it lives. The niche is going to be where it gets its water. The niche will be what food it eats. And it's going to be very, very specific. It's not just going to be what food it eats, but it's going to be when it eats the food, how much of the food it eats, how it gets the food. Does it capture it a specific way, or does it eat the leftovers from a different species? Something like that. So all of these really, really specific details create more variation. So for example, here we have a tree, and on this tree we have 5 different species of birds that are all able to interact with each other and find harmony because of a niche. So they are coexisting on this plant, on this tree. And the reason they are coexisting is because their niches don't really overlap very much. You have their location, where they live on the tree, is going to be different from each other. Their sources of food are going to be different each other. If they're living in different parts of the tree, then they're also going to be eating food from that part of the tree. So the bird up here that lives on the top is not going to compete with the birds that live towards the bottom. So there's no reason for them to have any competition. There's no reason for them to cause each other to maybe disappear and have one of them win and the other one goes extinct. So basically, a niche is really important for the survival of a species, and the species has to be as diverse as possible in order to have a niche that fits into an ecosystem, so it avoids having too much competition. And again, the same thing happens with business. A company has to have a niche, has to have a specific way that it creates its product, how it delivers its product, how much it sells its product for. All of the different things that make that business are that business's niche. And in order for it to survive in the market, it has to make sure that it has a varied niche so that it doesn't compete too much with other businesses. So the ecological niche is going to be the type of food, the amount of food, the space, all of the details about that species and how it interacts with the environment. And there are different sizes to a niche. There is the fundamental niche, which basically means is all of the resources that can be used, not necessarily that are actually used, but all of the resources that are possible. So for example, this bird here, this fundamental niche is this whole area, but it doesn't necessarily need that entire area to survive. Maybe one of the birds can live here, one of the birds can live here, one of the birds can live here, one of the birds can live here. So there's the fundamental niche, which is everything that is available to the species or to individuals of the species. And then the realized niche is the actual one, the one that they're actually using. So if a group of birds never really move beyond this point of the plant, of the tree, that's their realized niche. That's what they're actually surviving on, even though they have more area that is available to them, they're not actually using it. Okay? So the thing, again, to remember about this is that niches are important because they allow for there to be less competition. Competition is important in nature, and we do want competition to exist, but too much competition is not a good thing. We cannot have diversity, we cannot have biodiversity, have many different types of species, many different types of plants, and flowering plants, and bushes, and fish, and birds, and insects, and reptiles. We cannot have a lot of biodiversity if there is too much competition. So by having a niche, it helps us, it allows ecosystems to limit the amount of competition so that we can have more biodiversity. So now that we've kind of set up how biodiversity is important to an environment, and how ecosystems are designed in order to allow for biodiversity, let's just talk about what biodiversity actually is. So there's biodiversity is diversity. So variation inside of a community's niches contributes to its overall biodiversity. And the more biodiversity you have, typically the more stable an ecosystem is going to be. More variation equals more stability, because if there is some type of dramatic shift, some types of change in the environment, it doesn't even have to be dramatic, but just a change in the environment, the ecosystem won't crash. So the ecosystem will continue. Life will continue to exist in that environment, even if there is a sudden or even major change to the environment. So more biodiversity means more stability. So biodiversity is the degree of variation of life forms in an ecosystem, and we can measure biodiversity in a couple of ways. First off, we can just look at the variation of the ecosystem itself. Is the ecosystem just a forest? Is it a forest with mountains? Is it a forest with rivers and lakes? Is it a desert? Is it a desert with rock formations? Is it a desert with oasis? If it's an ocean, which part of the ocean is it? Is it near the coast, where the coast is going to have the shore? It's going to have the part of the shore that is partly underwater for some of the day and partly above water for other parts of the day? Is it going to be the part just just deep enough into the ocean that it's always underwater? Is it going to be a part of the ocean that has the really, really deep section where there's not much light getting down into it? So the more variation in an ecosystem, the more niches that can exist. So if you have more niches that can exist, that means you have more biodiversity and your ecosystem is more stable. So basically it's the number of varied habitats, or basically the number of niches that exist. Then we look at the number of species and the population size for each of those species. So it's not just having 20 different species, but the population size for those species needs to be relatively diverse. It's not great. Let's say that there's 20 species. Let's say there is 20 species, and species 1 through 5 have, let's say, 100 members. 100 members. And then species 6 through 20 only have 10 members. So it's great that there's 20 different species, right? But a lot of the species, most of the species, have very, very low numbers. So that's not so great for the biodiversity. It would be better if these populations were a little bit higher, because if they're a little higher, let's say maybe instead of 10, we said that they had 60-some members in the population. Because if they're a little bit larger, that means there's a better chance of it being more stable biodiversity. We don't accidentally lose one of these populations because of a shift in the environment. Okay, and then the last one would be the amount of genetic variation within the species themselves. So if we looked at one specific species, are they almost all clones of each other? Are they all exactly the same? Is there variation in color and variation in size, variation in behavior, things like that? So the more genetic varied a species is, we've already talked about this. Obviously, the more genetic variation a species has, the better chance it has at surviving, and the more genetic variations that species have, the better it is for the biodiversity of our ecosystem. So now that you understand how diversity would be measured, this is how diversity would lead to stability. So in my example, I said that populations 6 through 20, what if they had 60 members in them? And that's an oversimplified example, because actually what is going to happen in communities is that typically there's going to be just a few species that are called our fundamental species, and they're going to be the most important ones that the environment is going to be built around, and they're going to also be the most stable. And then from these stable core species, more and more diversity is going to be added to the environment. So in most communities that happen on land, what do you think the fundamental species are going to be? What do you think the most important, most stable part of an ecosystem is? That's right, it's most often going to be the producers, like your trees and your plants. So it's difficult to have an ecosystem that doesn't somewhat relate to trees and plants, right? Even aquatic systems are going to need some type of photosynthetic part to the ecosystem, because we're going to need to produce energy from sunlight. So typically in communities, you'll see trees and plants are going to be the fundamental species, and then around the fundamental species there's going to be 1 to 2 dominant species, and the dominant species are what's going to make up most of the biomass. So for example, in a forest, the dominant species might be certain types of birds or crickets or other insect species. If a certain area that doesn't have a lot of diversity, maybe it's just a few large mammals. So maybe a dominant species in the environment is deer or a wolf species of some sort. But it's going to be 1 or 2 dominant species that make up most of the members in that ecosystem. Then, when we rate the stability of the diversity, we're going to have to look at a couple of vocabulary. And this is some vocabulary that you're really going to need to know for the next PPT. So I think I'm going to review the next PPT, but make sure that you're understanding these words for the next one as well. So first off, we can look at the species richness. And the species richness is basically the species population. So, the species populations, how many different populations. So how many different species are we dealing with? So if we had 20 different species, that would be a good species richness. But if we had another area that had 26 different species, obviously the species richness is a little bit more diverse and is a little bit better in that different area. Then we look at our relative abundance. Abundance is, of course, how many members in each species population. So if we have 20 different species, and in each population we have anywhere from 10 to 60 members in those populations, that's going to tell us the relative abundance of each individual population. So then we put these two together, that's where we get the idea of what is our species diversity. And the greater the diversity, again, the more stable an environment's going to be. And then the other thing we look at besides species diversity, again, is our genetic diversity. To do genetic diversity, though, we're not going to calculate species richness or relative abundance. We're going to have to look at the variation of alleles in the population. So we're going to have to look at the gene pool and probably calculate an allele frequency. So we're talking about, for example, the Hardy-Weinberg equation from earlier units. Knowing what the allele frequency is of the different species, the different populations of the different species, tells us how genetically diverse they are. So when you use all the genes are the same, if all the genes are the same but the variation in alleles, that can lead to adaptations, and if there's better adaptations, there's a better chance of that individual species surviving if there is an environmental shift. The greater the chance that an individual species is going to survive, that means the better the chance that the community and the environment are going to survive as the environment changes. So then, how do we actually know if something is diverse? How do we measure biodiversity? I mean, we look around, we walk through a forest, and we can see trees and bushes, and we can hear birds, and we can see a couple of different species of birds as we're sitting in the forest and we're watching, and we assume that there's just tons of insects around us, and we can see a couple of insects, but there's probably way more species of insects that we don't see versus the numbers that we actually do see. So how do we actually quantify or measure the amount of diversity in an area? So we're going to need data. So we're going to need to calculate our species richness, our species abundance. If we can do gene studies, if we can actually get allele frequencies looking at the DNA of our individual populations of the species, that would be great. So we can take all this data and we can use it to calculate diversity through various equations. One of the ways that we collect data, or the process of collecting data, is called sampling. And to sample basically is to collect samples or small representations of species. So we either capture the species or we're just going to observe the species and we're going to write things down. And we're going to need to be out in the environment. There's different ways that we can do sampling. So we can focus on the species abundance and we can look at the distribution. And we can even keep specimens if we want to do genetic tests. We could capture live species, or we could capture dead species, dead members. We could capture live specimens or dead specimens and use them for genetic tests. Now, there's two different ways that we can do this. If we're in an area that's relatively the same, and it's a relatively large area, but it's relatively uniform everywhere inside that area. There isn't a change in the environment very much, in the habitat. We could just do random sampling, and random sampling is basically where you mark off a specific area. For example, here they marked off measurements of these sticks. They're probably about maybe 1 meter or 2 meter in length. 1 meter probably, and they're just using this area here. And they're going to look at all the samples that they collect in that area, and they're just going to use the samples from that area in their calculations to look at the biodiversity. So this is good for uniform areas. So if we're in a forest, for example, they're in a forest, the forest is going to be relatively the same everywhere. It's just going to be trees and ground. There's going to be space between the trees, and there's going to be trees. There's going to be bushes, but still the habitat is pretty much the same. So unless you change habitats or the area changes from one type of habitat to another, you can just use random sampling in order to do this. If you have a varied habitat, you're going to want to use what is called a systematic sampling. And in systematic is where you're going to collect data from a specific area because you're going to see if that area has an effect on the diversity. So, for example, with random, you're going to look in an area and just see how diverse it is. But with systematic, you're going to look at different areas in a location that has multiple habitats, and you're going to see how do those habitats affect the diversity. So, for example, if we're looking at where two habitats meet, so for example, a river or the edge of a forest or the ocean shore, so we could do systematic sampling here, we could do systematic sampling here, and because they're going to be slightly different habitats because they're separated by this river in the middle. So we're going to compare the diversity of those two different areas. So using systematic sampling. Or if we wanted to compare sampling here far away from the river and we wanted to compare our samples here close to the river, and we might compare these two different habitats, these slightly different habitats, and look at which is going to be more diverse, and we would make conclusions about why one area might be more diverse than another. So this is just a little bit of a preview for what is going to be the next PPT mix, where we will talk about specifically how we do random and systematic sampling, and then how we use that data to actually calculate biodiversity. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this. Here we go. So on this slide, I hope you enjoyed this. You have some practice paper questions, which is practice questions really. They're not practice paper questions. I had to make some of them up. So do questions 2A, 2B, and 2C, and we'll look at these. Check them in your notebook, and we will go over them in class, and we'll learn more of this information as we move through this unit. Okay, so thanks for stopping by.